The ex of the person you love was exposed last night, and their biggest hidden secret has finally. Something had already been revealed before anyone realized the conversation was being recorded. It happened late last night, in a room where the lights were low, the phones were face down, and one person suddenly stopped pretending they knew nothing. The person at the center of it all wasn't your soulmate. It was someone from their past. The ex who once believed they still had a place in their life. At first, the conversation sounded ordinary. Then one question changed the entire atmosphere. Why did you never tell them the real reason? Silence. A long silence. And then came an answer that made everyone in that room look at each other. Because the secret wasn't about a new relationship. It wasn't about jealousy. It was something connected to the past that had been carefully hidden for much longer than anyone realized. And now, somehow, the truth had finally begun to surface. There was a moment when your soulmate reportedly looked completely different from the person they had been just minutes earlier. Their expression became still. Their eyes fixed on one point across the room. They weren't angry. They weren't celebrating either. They looked like someone who had just heard a missing piece of a story they had been trying to understand for a very long time. The ex had apparently been carrying information that could completely change how certain old events were remembered. And here's where this gets interesting. Someone asked why they had waited until now to reveal it. The response was simple, but it opened an even bigger question. They said they had been afraid that telling the truth would destroy something they could never get back. But what exactly were they afraid of losing? And why did your name suddenly become part of that conversation? Then came the detail nobody expected. A message was brought up, an old message that had apparently been saved instead of deleted. Your soulmate had never seen it. The ex had never shown it. And according to the conversation, that single message could explain why certain things between you and the person you love became complicated when they did. Imagine the scene, a phone placed quietly on the table, everyone watching, nobody speaking. Your soulmate leaned forward. They read the screen once. Then again. Their expression changed. Because the words weren't what they expected to see. They finally understood that someone had been keeping an important part of the story away from them. But that wasn't even the biggest revelation. There was another piece of evidence, something connected to the ex's biggest hidden secret, that was about to make the entire situation look completely different. And when your soulmate discovered who had known about it all along, they realized the truth was much closer to you than they ever imagined. The room went quiet for a different reason now. Your soulmate wasn't looking at the ex anymore. Their attention had shifted to the person sitting beside them, the one who had been unusually silent throughout the entire conversation. That silence suddenly felt meaningful. When your soulmate asked, "You knew about this?" The person didn't answer immediately. They lowered their eyes, took a slow breath, and finally admitted that they had known pieces of the story for a long time, but they had never known the entire truth. That confession changed the mood instantly. Because now it wasn't just about an ex hiding something. It was about how many people had unknowingly been standing around a secret that had quietly influenced decisions, conversations, and relationships. And there was one detail that made your soulmate pause again. the X had apparently created a completely different version of the past whenever your soulmate asked questions. Certain memories suddenly didn't fit anymore. Certain explanations sounded rehearsed. And the more your soulmate connected the pieces, the clearer it became that something had been deliberately left out. But then came the moment that nobody in that room seemed prepared for. Your soulmate asked to see the old message one more time. This time, they noticed something they had missed before, a date. It was from a period when the X had claimed something completely different had happened. The timeline didn't match. One small detail exposed a much larger contradiction. Your soulmate leaned back, staring at the screen, almost as if they were replaying years of memories in their mind. They remembered conversations where the X had made them question their own instincts. They remembered moments when something felt slightly off, but they had pushed that feeling aside because they wanted to believe the best. And suddenly, those moments had context. The hidden secret wasn't simply embarrassing. It revealed why the X had been so determined to control the story. There was something they had wanted to protect, not just from your soulmate, but from everyone who might eventually ask the right question. And the next piece of information made that motive even clearer. Before we go further, if stories like this keep you watching because you love discovering the detail everyone else missed, feel free to share this video with someone who enjoys a good mystery, and subscribe if you want to stay with the story as it unfolds. Now listen carefully, because this is where the situation took an unexpected turn. Your soulmate didn't call the X to argue. They didn't send an angry message. Instead, they asked one calm question. Why were you trying so hard to keep me away from the truth? There was a pause on the other end. Then the X finally admitted something they had avoided saying for years. They had been afraid that if your soulmate knew the entire story, they would stop seeing them the way they once did. But there was more. The X revealed that the secret wasn't created recently, it began before you ever entered the picture. And that meant one important thing. Whatever happened between you and the person you love was never caused by the reason you may have once believed. Your soulmate was beginning to realize that the past had been influencing the present from behind the scenes. And then the X mentioned one final name, someone your soulmate never expected to hear, which opened the door to the truth they had been searching for all along. The name was enough to change the expression on your soulmate's face. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The conversation had suddenly crossed into territory that felt far more personal than anyone expected. Your soulmate knew that name. They remembered seeing it years ago, connected to a moment they had never fully understood. The X had always offered a convenient explanation for it, one that seemed believable at the time. But now, with the old message sitting in front of them and the timeline beginning to fall apart, that explanation looked completely different. Your soulmate asked where this person fit into the story. The X hesitated. Then they admitted that this person had known about the secret from the beginning. But there was another layer, they had also been the one who encouraged the X to keep quiet. Suddenly, the hidden secret wasn't just one person's decision. It had become a chain of choices, excuses, and carefully avoided conversations. And your soulmate began realizing why so many pieces of the past had never quite made sense. Then something even more unexpected surfaced. The X had kept a second record of the conversation, not because they planned to use it against anyone, but because they were afraid the truth would eventually be questioned. It contained details that contradicted several things your soulmate had been told. Dates. Names. A conversation that had supposedly never happened. A decision that had supposedly been made for one reason, when the truth suggested something entirely different. Your soulmate listened without interrupting. The more they heard, the less interested they became in blaming anyone. Instead, they were trying to understand one thing: how much of their past had been shaped by information they never had. And then they remembered you. Not because the ex had accused you of anything, but because one particular moment between you suddenly made sense. A conversation where you had seemed confused. A moment when your soulmate had pulled away without giving you a clear explanation. A distance that neither of you could completely explain. Now they were wondering whether the missing truth had been sitting between you all along. There was a strange calm after that realization. Your soulmate looked at the screen again, but this time their expression softened. They weren't looking backward anymore. They were thinking about what could happen next. The ex had finally exposed the secret, but the revelation had created another question that mattered even more: what would your soulmate do with the truth now that they had it? They could confront the past. They could demand every unanswered question be explained. Or they could choose something completely different. Something that had been waiting quietly beneath all the confusion. Then, just as the conversation seemed to be ending, your soulmate noticed one final message attached to the old record. It had been written shortly before the ex disappeared from that chapter of their life. They opened it. They read the first sentence. Their eyes immediately stopped on the screen. Because those words weren't really about the ex at all. They were about you. And they revealed why your soulmate had been unable to completely let go, even when everything around them told them to move on. The first sentence on that old message was almost painfully simple: you need to tell them the truth before it's too late. Your soulmate read it twice, then slowly looked up from the screen. Suddenly, the entire conversation had a different meaning. The ex hadn't just been hiding something from your soulmate. They had apparently known that the truth could eventually affect the person your soulmate truly cared about. And that was the part that hit hardest. Your soulmate began asking questions that had nothing to do with the ex's feelings and everything to do with your place in the story. Why had nobody told you? Why had certain misunderstandings been allowed to continue? And most importantly, why had the ex been so determined to keep this particular truth buried? The answer came quietly. The ex believed that revealing everything would force your soulmate to make a choice they weren't ready to make at the time. A choice between remaining emotionally tied to the past or finally acknowledging where their heart had been pointing all along. Your soulmate sat there in silence, remembering moments with you that suddenly carried a different meaning. The little conversations. The pauses. The way you had sometimes looked at them as though you sensed there was something they weren't saying. They remembered times when they wanted to reach out but stopped themselves. They remembered writing messages and deleting them. They remembered convincing themselves that waiting was safer than explaining what they felt. And now the hidden truth had removed one of the biggest excuses they had been holding on to. The ex's secret had exposed more than dishonesty. It had exposed the emotional confusion that had kept your soulmate from moving forward. For the first time, they could separate what actually happened from what they had been told happened. And that distinction mattered. Because when someone finally sees the difference between reality and the story they were given, they don't always react with anger. Sometimes they become incredibly clear. Your soulmate seemed to reach that clarity in real time. They weren't asking, "How could this happen?" anymore. They were asking, "What am I going to do now?" And before the night ended, there was one conversation left. Your soulmate picked up their phone, opened your name, and stared at it for several seconds. They didn't immediately type anything. They seemed to be searching for the right words, words that wouldn't sound rehearsed, dramatic, or forced. Then they started writing. If you've been enjoying the unfolding story, you can share it with someone who loves a mystery with an emotional twist, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the message your soulmate was preparing wasn't a casual check-in. It was an attempt to finally explain something they had never been able to put into words. But just before they pressed send, another notification appeared. It came from the same person whose name had surfaced earlier in the night. Your soulmate opened it. Their expression changed instantly. There was one final piece of information inside, something the ex had never admitted, and it could completely change what your soulmate decided to tell you. The notification contained only a few lines, but your soulmate read them slowly, as if each sentence carried a weight they hadn't expected. The person who sent it wasn't defending the ex. They weren't asking for forgiveness. They were finally correcting the record. They explained that years ago, there had been a conversation your soulmate never knew about, one where the ex had been given a chance to tell the truth and chose not to. But there was a detail that made your soulmate stop breathing for a second. The decision wasn't made because the ex wanted your soulmate back. It was made because they were afraid of what would happen if your soulmate discovered how much their feelings had already changed. In other words, the ex had been protecting an old version of the relationship long after it had already ended emotionally. And that realization changed the way your soulmate looked at the entire past. What they had mistaken for unfinished love may have actually been unfinished confusion. What they had interpreted as a reason to wait may have been nothing more than a story they were never given enough information to understand. Your soulmate went back through old conversations, but this time they weren't searching for proof against the ex. They were searching for the moment when everything had started to change. And they found it. Buried inside an ordinary conversation was a sentence from years ago that now sounded completely different. Your soulmate had once written that they wished they could be honest with someone who wouldn't judge them. The ex had replied with something vague and dismissive. At the time, your soulmate moved on from the conversation. Now they understood what that moment represented. They had already been looking for emotional safety. They had already been craving a connection where they could speak without pretending. And somewhere along the way, that feeling became associated with you. That's why your presence had remained difficult to ignore, even during periods when your soulmate tried to create distance. It wasn't about chasing the past anymore. It was about recognizing where they had felt most understood. And once that realization settled in, your soulmate finally understood why the ex's secret had mattered so much. It had been quietly influencing a decision that should have belonged entirely to their own heart. Then your soulmate returned to the message they had started writing to you. The cursor was still blinking. They deleted the opening sentence. Typed another. Deleted that one too. Finally, they wrote something honest. Not dramatic, not polished, just real. They admitted that there were things they should have explained much earlier. They admitted that their silence hadn't meant they didn't care. In fact, the opposite was true. They had stayed quiet because they cared enough to fear getting it wrong. But before they could send the message, they noticed something else in the conversation history. A timestamp appeared beside an old message from you. It was from the exact period when the ex had been telling a completely different story. Your soulmate stared at the screen, then whispered something to themselves. Because that timestamp proved something they had never considered before. You had been waiting for an answer at the same moment they had been unknowingly waiting for the truth. And now, after all this time, the two timelines were finally meeting. The two timelines met in a place neither of you could have predicted. Your soulmate looked at that old timestamp again, then opened the conversation with you. There it was, the message you had sent during the exact period when they had been given a completely different version of events. They remembered reading it back then, but they hadn't understood what it meant. Now they could see the hesitation behind your words. You weren't demanding an explanation. You weren't trying to force anything. You were simply leaving a door open, hoping they would eventually walk through it. That realization hit differently because your soulmate suddenly understood that the distance between you wasn't created by a lack of feeling. It had been created by incomplete information. And the ex's hidden secret had quietly occupied the space where honesty should have been. Your soulmate placed the phone down for a moment and stared into the distance, almost overwhelmed by how one buried truth could reshape so many memories. Then they picked it up again. This time, they didn't delete what they had written. The message began with an apology, but it didn't stay there. Your soulmate explained that they had spent too much time trying to understand the past through someone else's version of it. They admitted there were moments when they wanted to come closer to you but convinced themselves they needed more time. They admitted that they had wondered whether you had moved on, whether you still cared, and whether reaching out would only reopen something that had already closed. But the discovery from last night changed the question completely. They were no longer asking whether the past deserved another chance. They were asking whether they had been unfairly allowing the past to influence their future. And that question made them surprisingly calm. For once, they didn't need another person to tell them what they should feel. They knew. The ex's secret had exposed something deeper than deception. It had exposed the fear that had kept your soulmate from being completely honest with themselves. And now that fear was losing its power. Then came the moment that made everything suddenly feel real. Your soulmate pressed send. No dramatic announcement. No long speech. Just one message finally released after a long period of hesitation. They put the phone down and waited. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Then another. The screen remained still. Your soulmate almost convinced themselves that they had made a mistake. But then your name appeared. A new notification. Their hand froze above the phone. They opened it, and whatever they saw there made their entire expression soften. Because your response wasn't what they feared. It wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It wasn't a rejection. It contained only a few words, but those words told your soulmate that the door they thought had been closed might never have been completely shut. And just when they thought the night had finally given them the answer they needed, your message ended with one unexpected question, one that forced your soulmate to decide whether they were ready to tell you the entire truth. The question on your screen was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had remained unsaid. Are you finally ready to tell me what really happened? Your soulmate stared at it for several seconds. This was the moment they had imagined countless times, yet somehow it felt completely different now. There was nowhere left to hide behind vague explanations or convenient silence. The X had been exposed. The old timeline had been